everyone. My name is Abhishek Chanda. I'm a professor of economics in Sharda University here in India. I'll be your host for the day. Let me. Chandrachur is an author and writer on, researcher on historical on Indian history, and currently we have gathered to discuss the book. His upcoming book, 1947 to 1957, India, the Birth of a Republic. And this book covers an important, one which should say, a very, very crucial period in post-British Indian history, which is the decade immediately after the British, so to speak, left India. And this was the time when most, or if not all, of our important institutions and practices as a country, as a democracy, came into being. The transfer of power happened, the constitution was framed and accepted by the country. The bureaucracy was Indianized to the extent that it was possible, from a British serving agency to something that would serve Indian democracy. Apart from that, there were many important changes in the political thinking and practices. Most important, of course, was that since the British had gone, the fight for independence was over, but then the fight for prosperity started, and then the clash of ideologies between different parties started. One of the most, I think, significant events of the time were the anti-Hindi riots, which in South India, because of which the changes within the national politics, changes within national politics took place, which continue to till today. And then, apart from the formation of, the formation of the nation from the various principalities and the royal the royal holdings, the 600 plus royal provinces that were there, the whole country was formed from that. So that period gave us what we can today call our republic. And so it's important that it is discussed from a nationalistic point of view. So Chandrachur Ghose will take us on that journey. I hope not taken too much time. Chandrachur, please take it from me.
Thank you, Abhishek ji. Namaskar, everyone, and thank you for joining the conversation. I am deliberately saying it's a conversation because I would like it that way rather than being a lecture. One-way lectures are always very boring, without exception, unless someone is a phenomenal speaker, which I don't claim to be. And the book is already out, it's published and available. So those who are interested can get it from Amazon and in India, definitely. But there are certain providers in India who do send the books to the US and Europe as well. So if anybody is interested, I would be happy to share the details. Now, about the book and today's conversation. And actually, I don't know how many of you are aware that I have been working on the issue of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose's mysterious disappearance in 1945 for the last almost 18 years now. And me and my friends, especially Anuj Dhar, we have done a lot of work on this aspect. Our campaigns have led to declassification of thousands of documents, hundreds of files, which had been kept secret for nearly 75 years. So while working on that, it struck me. I wrote my biography, wrote the biography of Netaji, and then it struck me that uh, while we were talking about disappearance mystery, it is very intricately intertwined about the post-World War Indian politics. Why the whole issue of Netaji was not brought out in public, why it didn't come out, what actually was going on, I decided to have a deeper look into it. Because it's a fascinating aspect of our history, which is very less known and less studied. There are, I could think of only two books which are considered to be of some importance. One is by Bipan Chandra, another is by Ramachandra Guha. So I decided to look into this period. But to start with, I thought I should focus on the first 10 years, the first decade, starting with the transfer of power. Now, a lot of things have happened during this uh, decade. Firstly, the transfer of power. And all this, I should lay the context that why I decided to analyze or look into this detail uh, from a critical perspective is for the last 75 years, we Indians have been fed a standard narrative. The standard narrative stands on two pillars. The first pillar is that we achieved our independence in 1947 through the non-violent movement of Gandhiji. And the second pillar is that India could not have been democratic without Pandit Nehru. So Gandhiji got us freedom and Pandit Nehru got us democracy. These are the two pillars on which the official narrative has been constructed. As a result, everything else, if not pushed under the carpet, have taken a very minor secondary or tertiary position. Now, important questions were there, critical questions were there, but because of the dominance of a particular school of ideology, these critical questions were never asked. And I don't know if you have, if you are aware of this statement of Shashi Tharoor recently. I think it was last year or earlier this year in one of the uh, uh, conclaves, media conclaves, where he said that Indian history was constructed, written to cover up differences so that uh, old wounds are not reopened. So it was a project. Indian history writing was a project which was officially sponsored. So everything that was shown was put in a very good light, in a non-controversial manner, focusing on the contribution or the role played by a few, putting aside the immense contribution of a whole range of political leaders, activists, and parties. So I wanted to challenge, I felt that this narrative needed to be challenged. So the first thing was about transfer of power, winning independence in 1947. It might sound very uh, odd or awkward today when if I say that we did not win our independence in 1947. Power was transferred to Indians in 1947, and India did not become an independent nation republic. It remained dominion for the next 3 years and became a republic only in 1950. That is in the truest sense when we became an independent republican nation. And to reach this transfer of power, I will refer to it as a transfer of power. A lot of compromises were made. What sort of compromises I'm talking about? The compromises were very fundamental, of very fundamental Congress principles. When I say Congress, I'm not talking about today's Indian National Congress led by Sonia Gandhi and Rahul Gandhi. I'm talking about the old Indian National Congress, which was rather a platform which led the freedom struggle. What are these fundamental principles on which compromises were made? The first compromise that was made was on the aim to have complete independence or Purna Swaraj. The idea of becoming a dominion was categorically denied and rejected by the top level leaders from 1927. Now, you would have read in history books that the first time that the Congress adopted the Purna Swaraj resolution was in Lahore in 1929. But actually, the complete independence as a goal was adopted by the Congress in 1927 in its annual session at Madras, which was Madras at that time, Chennai now. But Gandhiji did not like, and there was a very sharp debate, discussion, and almost a fallout between Pandit Nehru, who had sponsored the resolution, and Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhiji said that this is untimely, India is not prepared, so this is foolish. And Pandit Nehru argued that this has to be done. So Gandhi said that, okay, if you feel that way, you go your way, I will go my way, and we don't agree. But according to a pattern which we keep seeing repeatedly between Jawaharlal Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi, is that although Pandit Nehru differed in matters of principle all the time, almost all the time with Gandhiji, he gave in to what Gandhiji wanted. He sacrificed his own principles. Here also he sacrificed that. So the next year, 1928, the Congress went back to the principle of dominion status, which was opposed publicly by Subhash Chandra Bose and Jawaharlal Nehru. And that was the year when these two became emerged as the national youth leaders, representing the extremist and the progressive section of the Congress. My apologies, I have a cold and fever, so this will keep disturbing a little bit. Uh, but this thing, this once this was adopted, there was no doubt that Congress would not go for uh, dominion status. It will not accept the status of being a dominion throughout the British Empire. And this argument remained till about 1946. But as soon as the lure of power was there, and this compromise told them that the power would be transferred to specific certain hands, the principle was compromised. So India became a dominion in 1947. The Congress forfeited the principle, it forgot the principle of police Swaraj. Secondly, the question of joining or not joining the British Commonwealth. India never wanted to. Purna Swaraj meant disconnecting with the British Empire in all manners. It was clear, implied, and explicitly stated that India would not be a party in a member of the British Commonwealth of Nations. But again, India joined under the Congress leadership, joined the British Commonwealth, and till date remains a member of the Commonwealth of Nations. Nicely, the word British was removed in 1948, uh, and it became the Commonwealth of Nations, but did not change the character of the association or the organization. So, and the manner in which it was done, it was negotiated between Pandit Nehru, Sardar Patel, and the British government. And once an agreement was reached, Pandit Nehru came to the Constituent Assembly and announced that the agreement has been reached and it has been signed. So the Constituent Assembly had to ratify it. There were serious questions raised, serious objections raised. Many members objected on the ground that you have already signed the agreement and it is now basically a fait accompli. You are just asking us to ratify. There has been no debate, no discussion whether India should join the Commonwealth. There is no broad debate or discussion. Forget the Commonwealth or forget the broader party platform or other political parties. There was no debate or discussion even in the Constituent Assembly, which was the legislative assembly at the time. So anyway, that was bulldozed through, and India joined the Commonwealth. That was the second principle where there was a world first or a U-turn, complete U-turn. And secondly, and the third point that I want to make is that, which is very important, that Congress wanted to win freedom. The people of the country wanted to win freedom. The Party was there, the Communist Party was there, the Forward Bloc was there, the Hindu Mahasabha was there. There were multiple political parties and associations or organizations They wanted to win freedom. But suddenly something changed towards the end of 1946 or the beginning of 1947 after Louis Mountbatten arrived as Viceroy of India, that the mode of agitation changed. The agitation was replaced by negotiation. So what happened is that throughout 1946, from the end of the 1945, the fire of revolt that had been lit, that had been catalyzed by the trial of the INA soldiers, and that led to a series of rebellions and revolts in the unthinkably in the Royal Indian Air Force, in the Royal Indian Navy, and across the country, across the student communities, across the interiors of the country. And there was large-scale sympathy about the INA soldiers throughout the country, and even the Indian armed forces, Indian soldiers in the British Indian Army, they were sympathetic to the INA cause, and so much so that the British administration was actually shaken. And the Congress fully utilized this phenomenon for winning for the purpose of the elections to the Central Legislative Assembly held towards the end of 1945 and the first half of 1946, the elections to the provincial legislative assemblies. They uh, utilized high-pitched rhetoric, political rhetoric, which was about taking revenge against the bureaucrats, the British bureaucrats, the Indian bureaucrats in the British system, who had tortured Indians, the freedom fighters, who had suppressed and gone against the interests of India. So all this was forgotten. The path of mass agitation was sacrificed at the altar of palace compromise. I wouldn't say palace intrigue, although it verged on that. But finally, the nationwide agitation that was supposed to bring in, usher in independence was put aside, and the final decisions were made in the viceregal chambers in Shimla. So, and that too amongst only a handful of people. There was Jawaharlal Nehru, there was V. Mountbatten and his associates, including Indians like V.P. Menon and Jawaharlal Nehru's close associate and right-hand man, V.K. Krishna Menon. Sardar Patel was kept informed, kept in the loop about what was happening. So, in a very close and restricted circle, these final decisions were made of joining the Commonwealth, of becoming a dominion, and it was not something that was decided on the larger, wider political field. So, compromises were made on the principles and on the aims and ambitions. And naturally, as happens, that when such a sharp transition takes place, there are impacts. And one of the impacts of concentration of power in a few hands resulted in the partition of the country. And I mean, uh, it is not very well known that we blame Jinnah, and rightly so, for the partition because of his demand and everything. But many of us are not aware that as late as the end of 1946, middle of 1946, Jinnah had agreed to an unified, united India, which was the cabinet mission's proposal. And he went back from that position because of a very provocative press conference statement made by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. So, if we have to find people responsible for the partition of our country, it is not only Jinnah, but there are Congress leaders as well. And that is when this happened, Jinnah announced his direct action program and policy. And once the direct action program started from the mass killings in Calcutta, things took a very different shape. And it was a domino effect which nobody could thereafter control. Now, once this happens, this is about the transfer of power, but there is a very important aspect about our constitution making also. The Constituent Assembly, the members of the Constituent Assembly were chosen, elected by the members of the provincial legislative assemblies. And the electorate, Congress had raised the issue of universal adult franchise from 1931, and we are talking about 1946. The electorate which elected the members of the provincial legislative assemblies were just about 6% of the country's population. It was that narrow. And the population and the electorate which elected the central legislative assembly members were less than 1%, close to 0.5%, half percent of country's population elected central legislative assembly members, and 6% of the country's population elected the central or provincial legislative assembly members, who in turn elected the members of the constituent assembly. So that makes clear that such a narrow base, the constituent assembly was elected on such a narrow base and was so overwhelmingly dominated by one political party and its program that divergent views really did not have place. Thankfully, Congress was still a platform, and there were divergent views and voices. There were voices like people by the members of the Socialist Party, like Hari Vishnu Kamath, who belonged to the Forward Bloc. They were all elected on Congress tickets, but they raised their voices. But their voices were not powerful enough, or they did not have enough support to influence the outcome. The outcomes were pre-decided in the steering committees, in the drafting committees, in the union committees, provincial subject committees, well, which were again discussed beforehand in Congress parliamentary party meetings. So one political party overwhelmingly influenced the outcome of the constitution making process. In fact, I will give you one example how things were influenced. Recently, we passed the 128th Constitutional Amendment Act, providing for reservation for reservation for women in the provincial legislative assemblies and also in the Lok Sabha, in the central parliament. So there has been so much after so much delay. We got this provision. Now the fun fact is this reservation of seats for women was already present in British India. The Government of India Act 1935 had provided for reservation of seats for women. And women were elected from separate electorates and they had separate seats. But in all their wisdom, our constitution makers, particularly the women leaders, the women members, they staunchly opposed this move. And from a very false Gandhian utopian dream, this whole issue was approached. It was believed that Gandhiji had ushered in a new era which had obliterated the differences between men and women. And since the fundamental rights were already in principle passed, accepted by the Constituent Assembly, there was no more any difference between men and women. And things would go very nicely after the Constitution was passed. So, as a matter of self-respect, and I don't really understand the political logic of it, because if it was based only on pious hopes, I fail to understand why that pious hope was not applied to other communities for whom reservations were made or special provisions were made. Because a constitution is not built on pious hopes, but it gives a framework which is supposed to protect the interests of disadvantaged groups. So, and that's a noble approach, and that's a right approach. And but if that was done for certain communities, certain sections, why was it not done by the for the women, who it was clear to everybody at that time in what condition they were in the country, and there was no scope for any illusion. But the reason was that the Congress party did not push for this agenda. Even Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru took it in multiple, many of his speeches. He mentioned it as a relatively unimportant issue or a secondary issue. It was not important. So the agenda was set by one political party and the handful of leaders which guided that party. That was my limited point. And as it happened, because of this concentration of power, Nehru kind of became the undisputed leader within the party, and subsequently through machinations which moved out oppositions or opponents like Purushottam Das Tandon, who had a different voice to speak with. Pandit Nehru becoming both the president, taking the post position of the president as well as the prime minister, and consolidating everything in his hands. So there was no challenger to Nehru. Potential challengers who had raised hopes, people like Jayaprakash Narayan, people like Ram Manohar Lohia, they came out as disappointment because they could not make up their mind between the options, political options available, whether they should support the Nehru government all the way or oppose all the way or remain somewhere in between. As it happened, although they opposed the government in every manner, and they did not want to destabilize it, and in the process they lost out in the political struggle. The person who had a different point of view and could really challenge Pandit Nehru in matters of governance and policy within Congress, within the Congress High Command was Sardar Patel, and he passed away in 1950. That created a vacuum which went in Pandit Nehru's favor, and he could further consolidate utilizing that vacuum, that gap. The opponent which really came out was unexpected, who could throw a challenge at the national level to Pandit Nehru, both as an individual and organizationally. And this is not my speculation. I am quoting Pandit Nehru from his letters he wrote on the eve of the first general elections, where he named the Bharatiya Janasangh and Shama Prasad Mukherjee as the only factors which bothered him. He was not worried about any other political party, organization, or leader. He was concerned about Shama Prasad and Bharatiya Janasangh. Shama Prasad, as such as it is, became the unofficial leader of opposition in the parliament, and unfortunately for India, he passed away in such a manner. Nobody knows exactly what happened. There is still a mystery around surrounding his demise, and that was in any way whatever happened. It was a blow to India's democratic development. But the Congress itself was breaking down. It was breaking up. There was a dissidence in all the state in the provincial organizations. So from 1946, we see that the Congress High Command's efforts to send back Chakravarti Rajagopalachari at the helm of affairs in the Madras province at that time failed repeatedly, with leaders like Kamraj Nadar and T. Prakasham coming together to to prevent that effort of the High Command. And explicit directions from the Congress High Command also failed to involve or influence the southern leaders. So as a result, Rajagopalachari had to be taken back to the central level politics and given posts there. And later on, when he was sent back again as chief minister of Madras, he barely survived a short time and had to resign again quickly. He had lost his position there. In Bihar, we see the same struggle. In West Bengal from 1941 onwards. The first thing that happened in West Bengal was that in 1946, Prafulla Chandra Ghosh, who was the biggest Gandhian supporter in Bengal Congress, was selected the premier. But within a short span of time, he was shooed out of the Bengal Congress ministry. He was removed from the position of the premier, and in his position, Bidhan Chandra Rai was brought in. But within a short period of time, by mid 1949, there was a huge tussle between Pandit Nehru and Bidhan Chandra Rai about the organizational state of Congress and the administrative capability of Bidhan Rai's government. Same thing was happening similarly was happening not so much probably in Bombay as so much as in central provinces and similar states. So Congress was had begun the process of disintegration, and the first indication was the breakaway of leaders from Congress and forming the Praja Socialist Party. In 1948, the Socialist Party broke away from Congress and formed a separate political party, but it was not much of a challenger. The Praja Socialist Party was formed thereafter, and so these splinter groups started moving away. Strong opposition from the left was seen in Bengal, led by the Communist Party and the Forward Bloc, and it really bothered the Congress High Command as long as Chandrachur Ghose was alive in Bengal. After that, it lost the edge somewhat, but the opposition remained, and the left kept consolidating its power there. In Kashmir, we see a very blind faith of the Prime Minister on Sheikh Abdullah, and forming the giving the special status, Article 370 in Kashmir, and at a time when I have seen public statements that from Sheikh Abdullah to the effect that it was a princely state, so it had to sign the instrument of accession to join the Indian Union. But whether it should go to Pakistan or whether it should join India, that was a matter of referendum. That was never taken up, and under duress, it joined the instrument of accession and decided to join the Indian Union. After that, it was quite clear through the statements of Sheikh Abdullah and the National Conference that the decision was made. There was no more. Pakistan had attacked, invaded Kashmir, so there was no more question mark on which side Kashmir should go. There was no more question of referendum, but it was the question of referendum was revived. It was artificially uh, kept sustained, and kept to keep the national conference in power, and to kind of uh, uh, keep supporting Sheikh Abdullah. Even Maharaja Hari Singh was kind of exiled from the state. So all these things were happening in the first 10 years. The whole terrain was taking shape. The political structure of the country was taking shape. But what was more important was, and this will be my last point in the opening remarks. After that, I would like to have questions from you. Was the reorganization of the civil service and the armed forces. That was the most critical because these were the two central powers, the two central aspects which held the country together. The armed forces, when the INA soldiers came back, because the elections were nearby, the Congress leaders started campaigning that in free India, the INA should form the nucleus, the core of the free Indian army. But as soon as compromises were being made and understandings were being reached and agreements were being signed, the tune changed and the INA soldiers were kept 100 miles away. And suddenly, the Gandhian High Command, the top Congress leadership, including Pandit Nehru, started parroting the line that the British soldiers should leave India, but the senior British officers should stay back and help rebuild India's army. Because without their help, we wouldn't be able to rebuild our army and make it a fighting force. So, uh, as a result, we had uh, the chief of navy till around I think 1950 58, and till the middle of the 1950s, we had the British chief in the Air Force. Same thing happened in the bureaucracy as well, where there were constant daily threats, which had both Archibald Wavell, the then Viceroy, and the Prime Minister, British Prime Minister Clement Attlee, worried that the threats to the British bureaucrats in India were were thrown at such high pitch level. They were worried, extremely worried, And the Wavell was repeatedly sending almost daily reports to the British government in London that the British bureaucracy was losing their morale. They wanted to leave India. They didn't want to stay back anymore. And but as soon as things settled down, agreements were reached and compromises were made. The senior British bureaucrats, and not only the British but the Indian bureaucrats who served and represented the British Indian government, they were recruited back and they were kept at the highest positions. They became the closest advisors to Prime Minister Nehru. So these change, this change of attitude, this change of mentality is remarkable. And uh, last but not the least, one aspect that I find has not been questioned enough or discussed enough. Whenever there has been a freedom struggle, a freedom movement, where a colonial government has been overthrown and independence achieved, the the local uh, uh, leaders of the freedom struggle, they have a program for reconstruction of the country, for rebuilding the country. But here we see a remarkable thing that because it was a transfer of power, because it was not something independence that was not won uh, by overthrowing the British. It was almost taken for granted that the system that the British had constructed, created, that would remain intact, and it remained intact. Only the white sahibs were replaced by brown sahibs. There was no innovation in the governance administrative system, only opened up to more Indians, but the structure basically remained the same. The attitude and the mentality remained the same. Even the laws, the legal framework remained the same. India's constitution borrowed to a great extent from the Government of India Act 1935. So then one can be nice and say that this was a nice transition. But then when we look at the politics of today, there is a very strong questioning spirit about what happened in those years and if things had happened differently. Uh, if if we could have a system which was more tuned towards the Indian ethos rather than adopting the entire British administrative system, parliamentary system without much wide debate. The debate was primarily limited towards within the few constitutional experts within the Constituent Assembly, and not a widespread debate. And in the Constituent Assembly, as I said, it was dominated by the Congress. So it really had a very skewed representation based on a very small, very narrow electorate, and the result was that what we were left with the system that the British had built over a century, and we liked to continue with that, even with their laws, with their emergency laws, and everything. I mean, the funny thing is that when the NDA government came to power in 2014, one of the tasks that it took up was to remove hundreds of laws from the statute book, which had become archaic, irrelevant, and had no relevance, no functional relevance at all in our present day. So that was the level of what should I say, shortiness, I would like to say, towards looking at the regime change. Because when independence happens, if you look at the colonial overthrow of colonial powers and emergence of uh, nationalist regimes, they build a system which is more suited to their nationalist ethos. But the question mark here that I have raised is whether that was done. I would say it was not done adequate. That's my assessment, and probably it should have done in a different way. So these are a few opening remarks to explain what I have dealt with in the book. There is obviously far more detail. I have not got into the details. It's not possible. But I would be happy to answer if you have questions and discuss these issues further.
Good evening, Chandrachur. I have a question regarding the how the Indian Army was treated. You said that the British officers were retained in order to rebuild the army, etc. But in the 1962 war, I remember reading, not sure, that the Indian Army had been reduced to about 200,000 people, soldiers, right? And there was Nehru's insecurity regarding armed forces also. How did that play out? How did the British officers' presence in India and Nehru's attitude or insecurity with regards to basically anything that opposed him, but specifically in this context, how it worked out towards the Indian Army and how it impacted, if you can comment on that, the 1962 war. I mean, it's still outside the purview of the book. It's be
That's right.
five.
That's right. So it's outside the time zone of the book, but I will try to answer your question as much as possible. Uh, the fear of the armed forces, particularly if you're referring to coup, was not yet prominent at this time. What was prominent at this time was a very Gandhian distaste for armed forces. That India is the land of Gandhi. Why do we need armed forces? We should do well enough for with police forces. Just some police forces we should be able to, because we are here, we are in this world to preach non-violence and love. So why do we need an arm? That was the basic thinking. Now, the again the funny part, and there are so many contradictions and discrepancies between what was preached, what was done. Uh, that's a, uh, I will be harsh because I have to speak the truth. That is a characteristic feature of Gandhian politics. You think something, you believe something else, you say something else, you do something else. The ideal is always the highest, but the what happens on ground is never reflecting the ideals. But the ideal has to be high so that you can change your activity and strategy accordingly whenever required, whenever convenient. Here in this thing, I mean, the president of the country was the supreme commander of the armed forces. And when Rajendra Prasad became the president, we find Rajendra Prasad writing to Prime Minister Nehru that why are we spending so much on armed forces? Why can't we reduce it drastically? And what is the need? Because India is the land of peace, and if we as followers of Bapu cannot demonstrate to the world that we can survive through peace and love, then how can we call ourselves true Gandhians? Now, everybody survived, subscribed to Gandhian principles. Nobody in Indian politics can survive by criticizing Gandhi. That's the central feature of Indian politics. Everybody has to praise Gandhi and say that he believes in that. Now, as it happened for these years, the Indian budgetary allocation to armed forces was 50% of the budget. And obviously, nobody liked it. Pandit Nehru also did not like it, but there was very little he could do. And it continued. So, the land of Gandhi, of peace and non-violence, was spending 50% of its budget, a land, I mean, the country which did not have enough money to feed its people, was in a famine situation, did not have adequate health infrastructure, even the basic health infrastructure, did not have education system, and physical infrastructure one can even forget for some time, was spending 50% of its budget on armed forces for the first few many years. So that's what was happening. And that's what was at the uh, center of weakening of the armed forces. Uh, this dilemma, whether we should have armed forces, whether we should strengthen it, and on the matter of purchasing equipment. Uh, after even after India became republic, one of the key advisors of Jawaharlal Nehru was Louis Mountbatten, and we being a member of the British Commonwealth, we got good deals in buying second-hand equipment, which the Britishers were about to retire. So we used to get the aircraft carriers and all those things at a cheap rate, which were almost at the end of life. And whatever we needed, they were given to us at deals which were struck because India was a member of the Commonwealth. And the attitude towards defense mechanism. So Pandit Nehru for a long time believed, until he was told explicitly by the British Chief of Armed Forces, that Indian naval force, the Indian Navy, the restricted role it was supposed to play was only to guard the coasts of India. And it should not look at a role at the larger waters, international waters, because India should not be interested in military conflict in the world outside. It's the if the Indian Navy was there, its limited role was to guard the coasts of India, and India would take buy equipment only that would suffice for that role. And it was almost the middle of the 1950s when Pandit Nehru changed his view on this after he was briefed by the British military advisors. So this dilemma, the force of the pressure of Gandhian politics, morality, whatever you want to call it, and the underdeveloped ideas about the importance of armed forces, of military development, although spending 50% of a budget, all these forces contribute to gradual weakening. And the 1962 uh, debacle probably should be looked as a blessing in disguise. That the debacle happened and then it awakened the entire country to the need for proper investment, effective, efficient investment, and reorganizing of the armed forces. I hope I have been able to answer your question.
Yes, sir. Uh, I have a question regarding the economics of the newborn country. So, this period, what were the economic choices that were made, or by deliberately, or circumstances forced those choices on us?
The economic background of this time was scarcity, was absolute huge scarcity. India was, as I said, that India was in a famine situation. There was huge shortage of food items, and India was asking for food aid from the US, from the Soviet Union, and from whoever it could, from the Netherlands, from the Dutch, from the French, wherever they could, they were asking for food aid. But the thing when now Shama Prasad was the industries minister, something that he did, in which he was supported by Jawaharlal Nehru, was the focus on increasing production. The first thing was increasing domestic production, and there that was right. That unless the production was increased, consumption would not go up, and economy would not grow. So to meet domestic requirements, first production had to be increased rapidly, not only massively, but rapidly to meet domestic requirements. And that required a lot of investments. These investments were coming in bits and pieces here and there from sometimes from the British, sometimes from the Americans, little from the Americans actually. But it started in a methodical way from the middle of the 1950s after India's relation with Soviet Union opened up after the death of Stalin. Khrushchev took over when Pandit Nehru went for his first trip to Moscow, and the Soviet leaders came in here. That was the time when things started happening, systematic investment on heavy industries. So the focus, and if you're talking about the economic, political economy, or the ideology of political economy, the idea was very clear that India was a socialist country, and the means of production would very largely, overwhelmingly, would be retained by the state. but that would not mean uh, completely ruling out private capital. Private capital would be welcome, but even that welcome area would be decided by the state. So the scope was very limited, and hence the crony capitalism started developing to a great extent at this time too. But the focus was state investment, planning. Jawaharlal Nehru was influenced by some of his advisors at this time on national planning, planned economic growth. So that started around this phase. But it started in a manner which led to a serious difference with his finance minister. And John Mathai resigned in disagreement over the mode of the planning program process and how the whole thing had been taken up. The economic planning had been taken up by the Prime Minister's office. So there were serious differences on these matters. But uh, in increasing production capacity massively and rapidly, and state-led investment and planned progress. These were the principles that started taking place at this time. But India depended massively on foreign aid for its food program. There was the whole environment was that one of serious scarcity.
Could I pose a question from abroad, London?
Please go ahead.
This is Gautam Sen from London. Thank you. বাংলায় বলি ভালো লাগলো শুনে. I have one general question.
Sure.
The evidence unearthed by a number of people, first of all, Sadila and then Choitali Dasgupta, Ambassador Dasgupta, who has also written a recent book on the creation of Bangladesh, and also the very important book by General L.P. Sen, Slender Was the Thread.
Right.
Demonstrates the importance of geopolitical calculations in the creation of Kashmir. And if you look at the discussions between Wavell and even Auchinleck, there was a difference of opinion. Auchinleck did not think partition was necessarily required, whereas Wavell was very determined. And I have written recently, you may have seen in First Post, that it was my belief that Wavell and Governor Burroughs used the Calcutta riots to demonstrate what would happen if there was no partition. This is something I've written about in the last 8 months. Now, it seems to be this geopolitical aspect is rather underestimated in our understanding, but maybe this is something you covered in your book, though I, of course, will only be able to get a copy when I visit in November. This is one point. Sure. The other thing, a very general comment, because I'm a political economist and what I taught at the LSE for 25 years, is that they grievously misunderstood the dynamic nature of an economy. They had a very static view of the economy, which is why they grievously understood the lack of state capacity, and they underestimated the importance of private initiative. But of course, this was a prejudice shared around the world from the 1930s because of the Soviet example. And we actually copied a lot from France. Okay, this is a forgivable mistake, it's a serious mistake for which we lost about 15 years of economic dynamism. But my main point is that we have not fully understood the geopolitics of India's partition. And in a way, my dear friend Venkat Dulipala has shown in his magnificent book that the clergy were very keen on partition. It was not a historical accident like Aisha Jalal has said, that it happened by chance, and this is not what Jinnah wanted, but Venkat has shown there was huge consensus. But in the end, the British used the consensus because the discussions make very clear that they wanted a barrier to potential Russian expansion. Now, this, in retrospect, turned out to be a very foolish understanding because it never came close to happening, except when Russia came to Afghanistan much, much later. But do you have a comment on the geopolitical aspect, which I think our leaders did not really grasp? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very interesting perspective, questions. And well, geopolitical perspective, the geopolitical factor in the British government going for accepting partition is very strong. I mean, it cannot be denied. And I don't know, I can't say on the basis of the documents which I have seen whether that was the overwhelming or the predominant determinant for agreeing to partition. Because here I would like to disagree with you on one point about Wavell being keen on partition. Uh, Actually, Wavell is given far less credit, and he's more discredited for his role. I mean, following the cue of Churchill and Attlee, who was very, very annoyed with him. Had it not been for Wavell, I doubt if India would have got uh, freedom when it did. Wavell initiated the process in 1945, in 44, October, on the first year, completion of his first year as India's viceroy. And in doing that, he almost picked up a fight with Churchill, because Churchill was not even ready to countenance that question. Because for Churchill, his famous phrase, which he told Wavell almost a year later, that the India question can be kept on ice. It was not important for him. It was only when the British elections were nearing that he wanted to utilize the India question and directed the holding of elections. But Wavell pushed for giving constitutional concessions and starting the dialogues for the constitutional reforms. It was not independence, but for handing over substantial power to Indian hands, and sharing power, transfer of power, basically what he was looking at. It was not in the form of complete independence, understandably, but the credit has to go to Wavell to start the dialogue with the home government almost a year before the Second World War ended. And when you go through the transfer of power documents, the correspondence between Wavell and the governors of the provinces and the Secretary of State and the Prime Minister and the India Committee, it comes across very strongly that in principle Wavell was opposed to partition of India. He was probably sympathetic towards Jinnah comparatively compared to Gandhi. He was pretty fed up with Gandhi's language of politics, and that probably led him to uh, lean towards Jinnah. But that did not mean that he was giving in for the idea of partition. On the contrary, he was. I have seen categorical statements where he argues very strongly against division of India. It was the scenario changed with the arrival of Mountbatten, because Mountbatten was in a big rush to leave India. He was not keen to stay in India, and by that time, because of the direct action program, the violence had escalated to a level where they were not able to manage anymore. The British was not willing, and the Indian leaders, the Congress High Command, did not have the ability. So it was the division was the easy and quick way out, and Mountbatten pushed for it. That was the Mountbatten plan. And division, partition of India, which when we talk about division of India, one thing is almost always never discussed. It always remains under the table, under the carpet. Is that Congress agreed to partition of India or division of India in 1942, when the Congress Working Committee met at the time of Cripp's mission. It refused Cripp's proposals, but the Working Committee resolved, and in its resolution, it stated that if any part of India wants to move out, if any constituent part of India or population wants to move out or break free, we cannot stop. That is agreeing to partition, division of the country. But because by that time, the demand for partition had been raised. And by stating that in Congress resolution, you are virtually opening the door. And that is what came back to haunt Congress in 1946, when Congress tried to posture against as anti-partition. Maulana Azad is writing to Sardar Patel, but how can we oppose it any further? Because we have already agreed in principle. The working committee has passed a resolution accepting the rights of certain communities or groups of people or geographical units to move out if they so want. So it's and as I said during my initial remarks that uh, uh, everything said and done, we have to remember that Jinnah had agreed to the cabinet mission's proposal for a united India, and he backed out and declared direct action for Pakistan only after the press conference held by Pandit Nehru. So geopolitical issues concerns were there, no doubt, but I don't think they were the defining or determining or the overwhelming factors that led to partition.
I need to ask a question. Should I?
We are running short of time. So, Chandrachur, would you be comfortable taking another question?
Okay,
Um,
maybe the last question.
I think we are just out of time, about 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay, let's be brief
If
then.
I think we can close the session now. If people are interested,
Hello.
we can. Yeah, hello.
Yeah, hello, sir. I had just one
um,
last question.
Okay,
So
Who's
it was
speaking,
on Ameya, sir. Ameya. Hello, sir.
Acha, okay.
So can you shed some light on the industrial policy of India
I-
after the death of Shama Prasad Mukherjee's resignation? Because
okay,
he had a
sir.
very
We are just we have a time limit of an hour on the recording, so we'll have to
Okay.
close now. Yeah, if people are interested, perhaps a second session can be arranged. However, I think we should close now. Chandrachurji.
Okay. I'm happy to do a second
So
session if you plan so.
yeah, that we'll leave for a little later. Chandrachurji, so much thanks to you for joining us despite your sickness and discomfort.
My pleasure.
Uh,
Thank you.
and everyone, please do buy the book and promote the book so that we have more participants in the next session. I have a couple of questions, pretty relevant ones, but because of the time, I will not be able to ask them regarding FDR and how US played a role in our independence, and another one, if other countries' independence movements were also hijacked by the British. So these are pretty good questions. I wish we had the time to take them, and also Ameya ji's question. So we'll just I'd like to thank everyone, and please do promote the book. Next time we would I will also like to come after having read the book. We'll have a much deeper discussion. And so that's it from us. Chandrachurji, if you would like to.
Thank you very much. My pleasure. Absolute pleasure to
Thank
be
you,
here.
sir.
And thank you
Thank
for
you,
joining.
Chandrachurji. Thank you, Rajivji. Thank you, Adarshji.
Yeah. Thank you,
Thank you,
Chandrachur.
everyone, for joining us and giving us your time. This is Professor Abhishek Chandra.
Thank you.